Last Mountain Lake is part of a series of lakes that have been sampled for the last 30 years now. So lakes in the Qu'Appelle Valley, we've been sampling them every 2 weeks in the summer. And so we've had a suite of characteristics that we've been sampling for over that long period of time. This was initiated by Peter Leavitt back in 1994.
What I wanted to do was work on environmental issues relating to water, develop a long-term record so we could measure how the environment was changing and use that as a basis for decision making. And I wanted to make a difference. And so Regina allowed me to do that.
Having this long-term data over 7 different lakes just gives you an absolutely phenomenal database to work with. I came here as a postdoc to work with Peter, and at the time I was sort of sold by this, at the time, 12-year database to come and work on that. And now I've been here 18 years.
The government uses the data and they use it to establish whether their policies are working in terms of environmental protection or management strategies. The First Nations use it to establish changes in the environment arising from violations of inherent and treaty rights. The public use it because people like to recreate on water and they want to know that the water's safe, it's potable, they can drink it, and it's okay for recreation. Farmers want to know because they use the water for irrigation, for livestock, and basically society has developed on large water bodies, beside large rivers, beside the ocean, beside large lakes. Without water, we don't have the basis for a lot of what we are interested in society.
So out on the water, we're collecting for water quality parameters. So we're looking at the temperature of the water, we're looking at the pH balance, we're looking at how much oxygen is in water for the fish, and we're looking at the salinity gradients as well. When we're collecting the water, we're going back into the lab, testing for water quality parameters as well. So we're looking at the salinity, we're looking at conductivity, we're looking at the amount of nutrients from the water. And with this, we're looking at how the land use surrounding these bodies of water impact the water quality.
The stuff that we're learning about water, the impact of climate, the impact of land use changes on the water, I think absolutely has implications globally. Because we don't have a lot of water, it means that we have a lot of stuff in the water that we do have, right? So we have really productive soils, we've got lots of nutrients, we do have salts in the soils. All of that ends up in our water one way or another. I think people that like water tend to go to like the boreal system where there's a lot of lakes, or the Great Lakes, or all these beautiful, really fresh waters. And so we have a ton of information about the boreal lakes, a lot less about these more solute-rich, intensely impacted systems. So I think what we can learn here is directly relevant to other areas of like similar climate that's understudied. But I'm also making the argument that I think, especially with climate change and with other changes that are happening in the environment, a lot of the things that we are seeing here, I think other areas are going to experience in the future. So salty lakes are natural around here, and they're really not a problem. They've been around for millennia, and so all of the plants and the animals that have been there for thousands of years, they're well adapted to it. There's a fully functional ecosystem within these saline lakes. So they're not a problem. They're really nice ecosystems to go out and study. The other cool thing about them is that what we found in our research here is the salt in the lakes actually reduces methane production. So we have less methane being produced and released out of the lakes and into the atmosphere. So we've got less greenhouse gases in these systems than what we had assumed based on research in other areas without the salt.
So they take up a lot of carbon in the forms of photosynthesis because there's a lot of algae in the water, and all that algae, over time, they die and they settle onto the bottom of the water and onto the sediment, and they store that carbon within that sediment.
So the problem with salts becomes more when you have a freshwater system that becomes saline. So if you get the road salts added, if you have other land use practices that are increasing the salts, then that can be a problem because the animals, the plants that are living in there, they're not well adapted to it. And so you're going to totally shift the composition of the organisms that live in there. It's also going to be problematic if you're trying to use that water for things like irrigation, for cattle watering, or any other, drinking water. All of this now requires that the water be treated. So a huge issue in Saskatchewan is these small farm ponds, the dugouts, and when they become saline, then it becomes toxic for the cattle. We have the data to be able to figure out how different changes are impacting the salinity. And so this can give people in other regions an indication of like how much things might change, how much the salinity might change, how the organisms might be changing within the system as the salts change over time as well.
When I started, I was mainly looking at the history of lakes. I was trying to use the mud at the bottom of the lake to tell me about the history of the lake and what that meant for the environment. So one of the very early projects was with a bunch of crop insurance corporations where we tried to determine how likely a catastrophic drought like the 1930s was to occur in the next 50 to 100 years. And we did that by going back 2,000 years and asking how often did these droughts occur in the past, and then use that with some mathematical modeling to forecast what they're likely to be in the future. And as a result of that, we determined that droughts are about a 1 in 2 chance of occurring or recurring at a severity that would change society in the next 50 years. So it's basically yes or no, 1-0. And because it's such a high likelihood, that's informed the crop insurance corporations that they should maintain a substantial amount of money in reserve, because the odds of a drought, one that could change how farming is done, are pretty much, it's more when rather than if.
When we work with communities, people are very, very interested. They're very passionate about their water. They're really, really concerned about the water. So it does tend to create conflicts around here. We do have a lot of issues where there's a lot of competing interests for the water that we have. But when you bring people together to talk about water, you realize that we all have this same common denominator of wanting to have safe, reliable access to water indefinitely into the future. And so the research that we're doing here is helping us figure out how we're going to reach that goal.